Professor Pascal Aquien, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to ask you a few questions to get your thoughts and opinions on your time here and on cultural diplomacy. Firstly, with the process of globalization and the adoption of English as a form of an international lingua franca, do you feel translation is more and more superfluous, specifically with the use of English being used in international meetings?
Well, I think that, in fact, there are two problems. The first thing is that English is obviously lingua franca, and it's absolutely necessary to use it internationally for diplomacy, for political reasons, etc. The question of translation is a little bit different. I mean, on the one hand, there is English as a kind of international language. On the other hand, there is translation, which is really about, literature, for instance, but not only literature, but my field is literature. So I think that in the case of literature, obviously, it is necessary to translate, because, as I said this afternoon, many works, we will not be able to read many works, for instance, in Danish or Japanese or any other language. So the fact that English is an international language is, I think, another point, really. And translating all the works or all the novels, all the plays that are available in any language is absolutely necessary. And I think that it's really something that is quite stimulating for people. I mean, I imagine that, I don't know, or a Japanese book translated into German is something that is quite appealing. Or, you could give any example, of course. And I don't think, anyway, that as regards English as a lingua franca, that this is a real problem. I mean, we have to accept the fact that the language has become international, and that it's very convenient and very useful. And even in French universities, we need students who are not specialized in English literature or anything, who study medicine or physics or chemistry or whatever, and who have to learn English and to be very good at it, and to be able to write articles in English and to publish them in English, and to take part in conferences, etc. So it has to be used as a tool. But translation is a totally different thing. Translation is an absolutely essential thing as regards the transmission of knowledge and the discovery of other cultures and civilizations. And I think that we all enjoy reading translations, even when you've got on the opposite page the original text, and even if you don't know the language very well. For instance, if you read Japanese poems and you don't know the Japanese language, so you've got the English or German or French or Italian translation, and it's quite enjoyable to see the original text because it's the real thing. And even if you can't read it, I mean, just seeing the text displayed on the page is quite stimulating, I think. So that's what I think, anyway. That's my personal practice.
And in your experience, can you point to any significant translations that have had a significant impact in terms of cultural diplomacy?
Well, I think that not many books have been translated into many languages, but obviously sacred texts have been. Yeah. And if we take the example of the Bible, for instance, it is clear it's not an example as regards in terms of cultural diplomacy, but it is the example of a book that is widely translated, universally translated, and that exerted a strong influence, whatever the place. If I take the case of the Bible, what is interesting is that it was a kind of revolution the first time the Bible was translated into vernacular languages, because suddenly it was introducing the sacred into, the everyday, world experience. And some people reacted quite strongly against it. But politically and culturally, it was, of course, very important because suddenly it became available. Now, if I took the example in the afternoon. I took the example of the Arabian Nights or 1000, yeah. And this, I think, had a very strong influence culturally, aesthetically, because in Europe everybody discovered the East, and it was a new perception, a new vision, which was probably wrong, of course. It was totally idealized, and it was not the real East, obviously, but it didn't matter. And if we take this example again, we must know that the texts that make up the Arabian Nights came from many different countries, not just India or the Middle East, but also Egypt and many other countries. And therefore, it was quite interesting to discover various experiences, various cultures, various countries, and put all together in a rather strange way sometimes. But at the same time, a lot of people discovered, cultural areas they didn't know anything about. And that was a major influence, really, as regards literature, because it informed really many novels in the 18th century, for instance, and then later, and of course art and painting, and it developed a political interest for these countries too, obviously. And cultural exchanges were quite numerous, and ambassadors, etc. And people became aware that something was happening there, and something that was, just not just the usual thing, strange people, these foreigners, but simply the idea that there was something really fascinating and interesting that could influence us, and that we should know more about. So this is a very simple example that is taken from the past. But I imagine that if we take I give this example, Achebe, the Nigerian writer, novelist. It is true that when he wrote and when he published Things Fall Apart, the influence of the book was tremendous, and it was translated into many languages, and it was considered a kind of manifesto against colonialism, etc. And it had a real impact, really. So it's a modern example, and more political, of course. The Arabian Nights is not a political example, but Achebe is a political example, and it is literature. I mean, it's not a political manifesto. It's a great novel. It's real literature, but at the same time, it had this influence. And I could give other examples.
Thank you. To kind of follow up to that, and you talked about the Bible and the 1001 Nights, the kind of Orientalism with it. I know there's been some controversy with translations and interpretations of the Bible, and in fact actually some people kind of see Orientalism as a somewhat negative thing. So is it necessarily the case that translation is always a positive thing? Is there perhaps room for political or cultural or religious manipulation to use it in a negative way, a kind of a dark side of translation perhaps?
A dark side of translation. I wouldn't say there is dark side of translation. The thing is that some texts should not be translated. I don't know. Many are some violent political manifestos, or we can think, for instance, of obviously Mein Kampf, for instance, which is the typical example of the text that should not be translated. You can find a few copies of the book here and there, I suppose, but it's the kind of book that should not be translated because of the obvious evil nature of the what is conveyed by the book. I think it's probably an exception, because otherwise I cannot really imagine that it would not be a good idea to translate something. The thing is that some books are not properly translated, and some translations are very bad, and then the fact that the translation is bad give a wrong idea, a wrong notion, in fact, of the original book, and this is a problem. As regards, if we take the example of the Bible again, it is true that there are many translations and many different translations according to the religion. I mean, there is a Catholic version, there is a Protestant version of the Bible, there is a Jewish version, etc. And the text is not exactly the same. So it's interesting to realize that a translation and the way it is performed, the way it is conveyed, a translation can reflect a certain point of view, which is not necessarily what you really find in the book, but the thing the people who will read the translation want to find in the book. And then it's not really a dark side, it's simply the idea that after all, sometimes it can be criticized as a translation, but not the act of translation itself. It's the practice itself that can be criticized. But otherwise, I cannot really find any. Maybe you're thinking of an example of a book that. What do you call this dark side? But as a translator, I came across very often, translation that I didn't like, because I thought that that had nothing to do really with the original text. I'm thinking of poetry, for instance. When you have a poem and then suddenly the poem is translated just like a prose paragraph, which happened in the 19th century, then it is a wrong. Of course, you've got the wrong idea of what the thing is. But at the same time, it also, even in the 19th century, allowed people to know more, to know something about a poet they couldn't read in English or in German. And after all, it's better than nothing. Although now we're working differently, of course.
And what do you think? Is it not plausible to suggest that translation subsumes the original cultural identity of a text? Can the original identity be fully articulated to a foreign audience?
So this is a very interesting issue, and of course it's the problem that whenever you try to think a little bit about translation and you study translation or you teach translation, it's obviously the question that crops up. That is, what happens, and what happens to the original cultural identity. I think that of course things are lost in translation. That's obvious. There is another problem. It is that sometimes words in a language refer to a reality that does not exist in another culture.
Yeah.
For instance, if you think of very simple things like flowers or plants growing in Germany, in France, in Britain, or elsewhere, if you want to translate a text that mentions flowers or plants into a language which, for instance, people living in Amazonia or people living in Africa in a desert or whatever, where those plants do not exist, then it's impossible really to do the translation. And so what can you do? I mean, you can just you can have a footnote or something and explain that the original term is this, but that there's no word in such and such a language to translate it. And so there's always a moment in translation when you feel that you are in a kind of stalemate. You cannot go further. It is something that happens very often. I remember an anecdote. It's a rather funny story. A few years ago, I read an article in Le Monde, which is a famous French daily, and it was an article about translation of the Little Prince, the Saint-Exupéry's novel that is very famous, translated into many languages, of course, many languages, hundreds of languages. But the article was about a language that is spoken in South America by a South American tribe living in a forest, and someone had the idea of translating the book. But the thing is that in this tribe, there's no social hierarchy, and therefore a prince is something that does not exist. That is, say, everybody is supposed to be exactly on the same social level, and there's no chief, there's no prince, no hierarchy whatsoever. And so it was extremely interesting, and that's precisely why the translator wanted to do it, because he wanted to see how far it could go in a translation. So we could think that in the case of The Little Prince, something of the book was lost in the translation, and that the original culture was betrayed, because the people who read this translation had no idea, in fact, of what A Little Prince could be, and so there was just the general atmosphere that was present with the animals speaking to the little boy, etc. And so that was a very funny example. It was quite interesting that this article should be published in a daily. I mean, it was not published in a specialized, journal or anything. It was really something that anybody could read, which meant that the problem is something that probably appeals, to a lot of people, and that many people are interested in that issue. What happens, in fact, when you cannot go that far. You cannot translate something that resists translation. So it's not the original identity can be sometimes left aside, but at the same time we can always believe that it's better, that it's always a good idea anyway to try, even if something is lost. And when you compare, for instance, translations of, if I take once again the example of the 1001 Nights, you compare French translation, English translation, or Italian translation, you can see that the text is totally different, and that it is adapted to the taste of the country. And especially, not nowadays, but especially in the past, 18th and 19th century, it had to be adapted to the what people expected. And that is very, very interesting. I will give you another example, which is really fascinating. The example of Gulliver's Travels, which is, of course, a wonderful, wonderful book. And it was translated into French in the 18th century, maybe 20 years after the book was published. And the translator was shocked by many things that he found in the book. He thought that it's not good taste at times, and that the French public, much more refined, of course, than the English readership, would not accept many things that you can find in the book. So the translator decided to leave aside many things, or to replace things by things that he considered were French and therefore were suited to the French taste. So a few things were not very important. For instance, tea was replaced by, let's say, chocolate, or the name of a street in an English street was replaced by the name of a street in Paris, which was stupid because the action did not take place in France. But other things, especially as regards, let's say, sex, which is sometimes a little bit explicit in Gulliver's Travels, or when there is a fire in the palace in Lilliput, and of course Gulliver is a giant, and so everybody is in a panic, and nobody knows what to do with the fire, and Gulliver has an idea, he's going to piss on the palace, and that's what he does, and he does it, and of course it's quite successful, and everybody's very happy, although the Queen is a little bit shocked, but it doesn't matter. The fire is out. It's okay. But according to the French translator, such a scene could not be translated, and so he left it aside or replaced it by something else, which had nothing to do with the original. So that is an example of this kind of attitude, which in fact is also the sign of a certain rejection of the other. That is, say, culturally or politically, the other is not as good as we are supposed to be. At least that was the position of the translator of Gulliver's Travels. Of course, afterwards there were many other translations, and all the translations that are available now are true to the original. And the original translation is considered as kind of interesting object that specialists of translation studies enjoy working on, precisely because of its originality. And what is strange, in fact, is the translation, really.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
That's
thank you
all
very
we've got time
much.
for. Thank you so much.